I cannot stress this to you enough. If you are 0-2, now is not the time to panic. All these panic videos that you're seeing on fantasy right now, that's just fantasy football's version of fear-mongering. What you should be doing, though, is taking advantage of the owners who are panicking, who are coming off an 0-2 start. So today we're going through some buy low trade targets that you need to acquire before week 3 fantasy football from really panicked managers. And I'm doing everything I can to get us ready for week 3 fantasy football without the fear mongering. So go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. Now, getting into our first guy right here, this one's going to feel gross, but I'm telling you right now, you should be targeting Brian Thomas Jr. in trades right now. Now, Brian Thomas Jr. has had one of the uglier starts of any high round draft capital wide receiver in fantasy football so far. Brian Thomas Jr. had 8.5 fantasy points in a half PPR format in week 1 and then 6.9 fantasy points in week 2. So he has done nothing to help your team win in fantasy football through the first 2 weeks right here. And a lot of people will just look at that number and say to themselves, well, why is he not working? What is going on? I thought he was supposed to be Jacksonville's wide receiver 1. Well, if you look under the hood, yes, he's still their wide receiver 1. If you look back to week 1, he had 7 targets and only one of them was caught. 1 catch for 11 reception yards and 0 touchdowns, but he scored a touchdown on the ground that salvaged his fantasy football day in some way, shape, or form. But in week 1, if you look at Travis Hunter's usage over on FSRoundup.com, he was used as a legitimate wide receiver 2 in this offense. Now in week 2, against just as bad of a defense at the Cincinnati Bengals, he did even worse work in fantasy football. But he had 12 targets in this game. So if you combine that with week 1, he has 19 total targets through the first 2 weeks. That is almost 10 targets per game for Brian Thomas Jr. Now, I will say the one concerning thing with Brian Thomas Jr. is if you watched any of that game yesterday, you'll see that Brian Thomas Jr. had a big drop in a big moment. So I'm not sure if this team loses confidence in him whatsoever or they don't. But I will say that Brian Thomas Jr. is absolutely the team's wide receiver 1 still in Jacksonville. Because if you look over to Travis Hunter's usage this past week, he was not used as much in offense. He was actually playing more defense in week 2 versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Who doesn't play defense? Brian Thomas Jr. So that is always a recipe for a wide receiver 1 in an NFL team. And on Jacksonville, who is currently putting up points against everybody they've played so far, you want a wide receiver 1 on this team considering what we saw from Brian Thomas Jr. last year. It is way too early to panic on Brian Thomas Jr. because every metric that matters as far as opportunity share, how many routes the guy runs on a gamely basis, and how many targets the guy gets on a gamely basis, all of those numbers are consistent with wide receiver 1s in fantasy football. So a trade idea I've got cooked up for this one personally is Chase Brown and Ricky Pearsall for Brian Thomas Jr. and DeAndre Swift. Now with this one right here, Chase Brown is in an offense that's about to go through some tough times because of the loss of Joe Burrow, who it looks like will be out for multiple months. So this lowers the upside of Chase Brown. But having said that, he has roughly the same amount of draft capital as Brian Thomas Jr. had. Ricky Pearsall has been off to a relatively good start, and DeAndre Swift the same thing. So there's a little bit of evenality in this one right here, and I think that this one can be pulled off because if the guy that you're trading with wants an upgrade at running back, for example, Chase Brown will offer that in theory. I think this is a good place to start with Brian Thomas Jr. Now, the next guy that I want to talk about today is going to be Calvin Ridley. And this one is actually out of left field for I'm sure many of you who have watched me over the past couple of weeks. Calvin Ridley I've been kind of exposing on an offense that is just not very good yet, but I do believe has more upside as the year goes on. Calvin Ridley, I did not rank him inside my top 30 wide receivers in week 1, and it was met with utter outrage. And I was right about that. He ranked inside the top 30 this week, and he still did not come through. But again, if we look at some deeper statistics here on what actually matters for Calvin Ridley, what we will find is he is still their wide receiver one in this offense. He had 8 targets in week 1 versus Denver, but he was playing against Pat Surtain the most of the game, so it did not work out in his favor. He got 4.7 fantasy points in a half PPR format. Now in week 2, he played the Los Angeles Rams defense, who I said leading into this game, still not a great opportunity. That is not a great matchup here. 7.2 fantasy points, 6 targets, 3 catches for 57 total yards. But if you look under the hood, again, like we did with Brian Thomas Jr., you will find based on routes run in week 1, total snaps in week 1, and just his total opportunity combined for 2 weeks, you will see that Calvin Ridley is absolutely their wide receiver 1. And I do believe brighter days are ahead for a quarterback like Cam Ward. So to me, a trade idea that makes a lot of sense would be Chris Olave and James Conner for Calvin Ridley and Bill Krosky. Now, I will be honest here. You may not get Bill Krosky, Ja'Cory Krosky merit in this trade. Someone may not be willing to sell off Bill Krosky for you in exchange for James Conner, essentially. But some might, and people who are not familiar and or panicking, I think you can be able to do this trade. And Chris Olave for Calvin Ridley is seeing the most amount of target share in his offense as well, but has actually been more effective with a worse quarterback. So I think that this is actually a logical trade for a lot of people who are struggling right now because Calvin Ridley was drafted to be a flex type of player. Chris Olave was drafted basically a round or 2 later and is actually being a legitimate flex player through 2 weeks. I think this one can go through. Now, again, these are just my initial trade ideas that I have drawn up for each particular player. But if you actually want me to break down your team and tell you what I think you should do with trade targets on the waiver wire, how we can make your overall specific team better, you can get a team breakdown from me personally by going to FS Roundup and signing up for the premium subscription tier, where after your 12-day free trial ends, I will break down your team personally for you. So if you do want to get a full team breakdown, in addition to the automatic waiver wire process and my weekly rankings, full rankings, go to FS Roundup and sign up for that premium subscription tier.
This is Ted. Look at him. Ted desperately needs to pick up a new running back, or his fantasy team is toast. For the 3rd year in a row. And losing his season again means one thing.
Oh, no.
Don't be Ted. Use Fantasy Football Roundup to automate your waiver pickups and take a breather this season.
Hey, you got 7 more laps.
Now, dropping down to our next player right here, I actually think this is going to be a guy that you could be sneaky with this week as well. Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. Now, I would not have put him on this list based on week 1, right? He had a great week 1 in fantasy football, but the week 2 performance definitely has some people worried, and I can prove that to you because I had somebody ask me on my waiver wire video that came out late last night, should I be panicking on Courtland Sutton? Absolutely not. That should be the farthest thing from your mind. But what it also proves is that people are panicking out there on certain players that they should not be panicking on. If you look at his week 1 performance, there was no need to panic, right? 15.1 fantasy points, half PPR, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 61 yards, and a touchdown. That's a normal Courtland Sutton stat line. He is not an elite wide receiver 1 in fantasy football. If anything, he's a low-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2 type of category on the higher end for Courtland Sutton in fantasy football. Now, you didn't see anything like that in week 2. He had 1.1 fantasy points in a half PPR format with 1 catch for 6 total yards. Now, it's also important to note here that that is not an abnormal Courtland Sutton line either. Courtland Sutton does have those games historically where he does nothing for your fantasy team. But on 4 targets in that game, that was a little bit unlike Courtland Sutton. And considering Bo Nix looked drastically better in week 2 than than he did in week 1, it was a little bit on the surprising end. But I will be willing to venture that Indianapolis will look like a much tougher matchup moving forward, and I was wrong on the Colts. That is one thing that could be discussed on tonight's What I Got Right and What I Got Wrong video. But I'm telling you what won't be discussed is Courtland Sutton's fantasy value. Courtland Sutton absolutely is this team's wide receiver 1 in fantasy football and will not be outperformed most weeks by Troy Franklin on this team as well. Courtland Sutton is still a wide receiver 2 for your fantasy team. So if you catch somebody that is really panicked right now on Courtland Sutton, I would go straight up Marvin Harrison Jr. for Courtland Sutton. Marvin Harrison Jr. has a little bit higher draft capital than Courtland Sutton, and at the same time, Marvin Harrison Jr. is a guy that I actually have more concern with than Courtland Sutton. They both had one good week and one bad week in fantasy football. But I believe in Bo Nix as a quarterback to provide fantasy upside for his wide receiver over Kyler Murray's upside long-term for the majority of the fantasy season. So this is something I would initially throw out to see if maybe they would accept it straight up, and then maybe we can work from there if they have interest in trading Courtland Sutton. Now, the next guy I want to talk about here is going to be Keon Coleman of the Buffalo Bills. I actually think this is a great trade target to go pursue right now. Now, Keon Coleman, what we found in week 1 was he was their dominant wide receiver 1. And I do remember saying this at the time with Keon Coleman, which was that, listen, what if Keon Coleman just had one of those games that felt like an outlier type of situation because the score of that game was so high? I mean, in that game, both teams put up over 40 points, and Keon Coleman had 21.2 fantasy points, half PPR, 11 targets, 8 receptions, over 100 yards receiving, and 1 receiving touchdown. I mean, that felt like a ridiculous stat line that I don't think we could expect moving forward. But I will tell you this, what we saw in week 2 also is not replicable as well. So as far as I am concerned personally, what he did in week 2, a bludgeoning beatdown of the New York Jets, 3 targets, 3 receptions, and 26 yards, is just as unprovable of a fantasy output as week 1 is. And based on what I saw from him as a receiver in week 1, I'm willing to bet, since we don't have concrete evidence after 2 weeks of Keon Coleman, that this is their breakout wide receiver 1. And the bottom line is, if he actually breaks out for the Buffalo Bills, this is a wide receiver you want a quarterback like Josh Allen attached to for fantasy football purposes. I do not believe that they are going to bludgeon every team like that this year. That was the New York Jets, and I warned it beforehand that that was going to be a blowout. But I do think that Keon Coleman legitimately could be a wide receiver 1, and the beauty of this one in particular is this one doesn't even take a panicked owner to get, because the draft capital used to acquire Keon Coleman for was not steep at all. It was not nearly as steep as the first 3 guys that we went through. Keon Coleman was a mid to late round pick in fantasy drafts this year. So what I would personally do is try to cook up a trade like Michael Pittman and J.K. Dobbins for Keon Coleman and DeAndre Swift. While J.K. has had more fantasy value to this point than DeAndre Swift has, I believe that DeAndre Swift is going to be the running back 1 long term, whereas I don't necessarily believe that for J.K. Dobbins. And then Michael Pittman has been more consistent through the first 2 weeks than Keon Coleman has. So I think that this is one of those situations where you can capitalize on the low draft capital for Keon Coleman, and then also at the same time get a potential massive upgrade if Keon Coleman hits. And if he doesn't hit, well, the reality is it didn't cost you that much. Now, the last guy that I want to go through here today was also featured in week 1, and I want to bring him back to the table because I still truly believe that Drake London is a great trade target before week 3 fantasy football. Listen, Drake London in week 1 had 15 targets in that game versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and he had 9.5 fantasy points in a half PPR format, 8 catches, and 55 yards. That's nothing to write home about, right? Well, that was the reason that I wanted to trade for him last week, is because obviously he was their wide receiver 1 by volume, but also their wide receiver 1 in all the other metrics that matter as well. Now, in week 2, he definitely saw less work in this game. 4 targets, 3 catches, 49 yards versus the Minnesota Vikings. Now, I did warn beforehand that this game was not going to be my favorite matchup for Drake London. Minnesota, although they couldn't move the ball because J.J. McCarthy, as I said, just flat out not very good, their defense is still really good. And Drake London, while he played, I'm sure was still dealing with discomfort in that shoulder as well. So he was off in that game. He had a fumble very early on the first touch of the game that he had, and he just wasn't really that effective for the team moving forward. But Drake London is still, again, a very high draft capital guy, very similarly to Brian Thomas Jr. That is the wide receiver one, and I actually think Michael Penix is a pretty good quarterback. Like, I'm willing to say that at this point. I think he's better than Drake May. I think he's a really solid quarterback in the NFL. Now, what I've got cooked up for Drake London personally is Davante Adams and Cam Skattebo for Drake London and Quinshon Judkins. Because what you're trying to do here is you're trying to give this guy a clear upside advantage in his head of wide receivers that he could get in return. And Davante Adams through 2 weeks has been more effective as a wide receiver 2 on his team than the wide receiver 1 in Atlanta. But the reality is that long-term, Atlanta's wide receiver 1 will be more valuable than Davante Adams as the team's number 2 wide receiver. And at the same time, 2 rookie running backs, one of them looks like he will clearly be the team's lead back, and the other one had a lot of glimmer of hope in week 2 to become the team's lead back in Cam Skattebo. They're both on bad teams, but I believe Quinshon Judkins will handle the majority of volume moving forward, other than Cam Skattebo, who I still do think will share with Tyrone Tracy Jr. This feels like another good opportunity to trade for Drake London after week 2 and before week 3 fantasy football. So let me know who you are trying to grab before week 3 fantasy football. And if you want to see the top waiver wire pickups for week 3, click on this video right here.